Springfield Church of the Brethren message of the week. Hi, this is Pastor Dave Weiss with a special bonus message for Springfield Church of the Brethren. This is from our Bible study series, Esther chapter 7. It's called Esther for Such a Time as This, What Came Around, Went Around. When we last left our story, things were getting kind of interesting. First off, Xerxes didn't have a clue. His wife was acting a little weird. She'd invited his chief advisor and most trusted confidant to a banquet 2 days in a row. That was odd, but it's always good when your wife likes your friends, right, guys? Xerxes just fixed an oversight that was made by rewarding Mordecai, who had previously saved his life, and he put his best man Haman on making the celebration work. And so he was sure it would be done right. As far as Xerxes was concerned, all was right with the world. Esther was in preparation for the second banquet. Now, of course, this was part of a larger scheme that had life and death consequences for both Esther and her people. Esther's uncle Mordecai was having a weird day. The king had discovered that Mordecai was responsible for thwarting a plot against him by some of his guards. And the king set about to reward him. The king instructed that a royal robe be put on him, and that he be put on one of the king's horses, and led throughout the city by someone shouting, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." And all that was kind of nice. But what was odd was the one who was carrying out the celebration was the man who hated Mordecai most in the entire world. This man was Haman, the king's most trusted advisor, and the man who was guest of honor at not one but two banquets thrown by Mordecai's niece, the queen. At the first banquet, Haman was thrilled. He went home telling everyone how important he was, but this day was turning out very different. Haman started off this day just tickled. The only thing to bring him down was his archenemy Mordecai, but Haman and his friends got that figured out. They built a 75-foot impaling pole, or gallows, depending on your translation, for the purpose of putting Mordecai to death. That morning, Haman was going out to the king to ask permission to kill Mordecai on that pole or gallows. After all, Haman was the king's right-hand man. He'd been invited to 2 banquets in 2 days. Surely the king would not reject his wishes. I can almost picture him gleefully skipping to the palace, but when he arrived at the palace, the king had a different mission for him. Xerxes wanted help to figure out how to honor someone he desired to honor. Well, Haman was so sure that he knew the king was talking about him that he all but forgot about his plan to kill Mordecai, or at least he assumed that the plan could wait, because surely Haman just knew there was no one the king would rather honor than Haman himself. And because Haman was so sure that the honor would be for himself, he laid out a fabulous honor parade through the streets of the city. Imagine Haman's surprise that the honor was not only not for him, but it was for the man he planned to ask to kill, Mordecai. And the king expected Haman to be the one to carry out the honor. At the end of their little parade, Haman knew something had changed. He ran home in mourning with his head covered, knowing all of a sudden things were not going his way. I can imagine all Haman really wanted to do was run and hide, but it was too late. The king's eunuchs were at the door to whisk him off to the party. And that brings us to chapter 7. Look at verses 1 and 2. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Remember, the king doesn't have a clue what's going on. There's a banquet, the wine is flowing. At the same time, there's an elephant in the room. Xerxes knows there is something on his wife's mind. He has made an offer to her of up to half his kingdom. But rather than telling him what she wanted at the last banquet, she just scheduled another banquet just for him and his buddy Haman, although unnamed guests may have also been in attendance. So once again, Xerxes makes the offer, up to half the kingdom. Now, it's Esther's turn to speak. Look at verse 3. Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request." Can you imagine the look on Xerxes' face? Wait, what? Can you imagine the questions that are going through his mind? Why should my queen be in fear for her life? Who would dare to threaten the queen and her people? And who are her people? I thought they were my people. I mean, hearing this request, he must have had a lot of questions, but before he got to ask them, Esther continued. Verse 4. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had been merely sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. Do you see Esther's humility here? Esther basically said, if it were just slavery, I wouldn't have bothered you. I wondered about that, but remember, the Jews were an exiled people at this point. Slavery was something they were fairly used to. And again, please remember, Esther never told Xerxes she was Jewish. And Xerxes never asked Haman who they were going to kill when he gave Haman his signet ring and approved the slaughter. Haman didn't know Esther was Jewish either. So imagine how he feels as this conversation happened. There was nowhere for him to run to. It seems at this point that Xerxes is starting to connect the dots. His queen's people have been sold into destruction. And I wonder if Xerxes realizes he was kind of the one who did the selling. Look at verse 5. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he? This man who dared to do such a thing. Do you get the idea that the king is a little hot under the collar at this moment? He had to know there was no one but him in the kingdom that could authorize wholesale slaughter, and if that's the case, someone has deceived him. Someone tricked him into signing the death warrant for a whole group of people, including his own queen. Oh, there had to be some serious rage happening in Xerxes. I wonder, do you think he looked at Haman? After all, he couldn't have signed that many death warrants. Can you imagine what Haman is thinking as Esther spoke? Look at verse 6. Esther said, an adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman. If Xerxes wasn't looking at Haman before, you know he was now. And the rest of the verse tells us, then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Can you imagine? Haman had to know it was over. He was a dead man. But think about Xerxes as you look at verse 7. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. Okay, Xerxes must have been really upset because he left his wine behind. But let's explore this a little bit. Have you ever done something really stupid? Maybe somebody tricked you into it, or maybe you did something without thinking it through, and after you did it, it blew up in your face. How did it feel? Now, to be sure, you don't have to be a great theologian to figure out the king is going to make Haman pay, but there's more involved here. Remember, the Medo-Persians considered their kings to be gods. Their laws were irrevocable. He's going to make Haman pay, but what can he do to save the people? So he went out into the garden to cool off and think. He left his alcohol behind, which I think is huge, and he's clearing his mind. There's a lot to be considered, and it's in this moment that we see Xerxes may be growing. And while Xerxes is growing, Haman is groveling. Look at the rest of verse 7. But Haman, realizing the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Now, consider how ironic this is. Haman was ready to kill an entire nation with no thought of mercy, and he tricked the king to do it. He spread the word far and wide so that none of the Jewish people would remain, and they had nowhere to run. But now the shoe is on the other foot, and it's Haman who has nowhere to run. This vile, hateful, evil anti-Semite is suddenly begging the Jewish queen for his life, and in the process, he went way too far. Look at verse 8. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. Now, picture how this looks. At these banquets, the people reclined around tables on couches. Esther's on the couch, and Haman has her cornered. She likely has nowhere to go, and he's no doubt invading her personal space. He's begging her for help. He's begging her for his life. He's throwing himself on her mercy, and it appears he has also thrown himself on her literally, just in time for the king to walk in. Now, if Xerxes was angry before, seeing this display likely sent him right over the edge. The rest of verse 8 says this. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Xerxes was already mad, But when he came back, it seems he actually saw this guy that he used to trust, who deceived him so badly, now has the nerve to touch his queen. Now, I'm sure that Haman was just begging for his life and nothing more, but you don't just touch the queen, especially after all that Haman had done. There are very clearly attendants there, and when they hear the king, one of them covered Haman's face. That's preparation for execution, folks. Now remember, the king sent his eunuchs to Haman's place to bring him to the banquet at the end of the last chapter. Well, when the eunuchs got to his house, what do you think they saw? Yeah, the 75-foot high impaling pole or gallows Haman was building in the yard, which brings us to verse 9. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He has set it up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." You know what happened here, right? What came around just went around. Not only was Haman a lying deceiver, but he was plotting to kill Mordecai, the guy the king, with Haman's help, had just honored for saving the king's life. Oh, this was not going to go well. What Haman wanted to do to Mordecai just came back to bite him. And the rest of verse 9 and verse 10 says this. The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. So what can we learn from this chapter? Well, once again, we see Haman's pride and his hatred were his downfall. Xerxes came to a place where he realized he had been deceived. Esther moved forward in humility. She took the wise counsel from Mordecai and kept silent about her ethnicity, but she spoke up at just the right time, and in the process she was used to save her people. Here ends the story of Haman. But the story of Esther is far from over. Haman may be gone, but the annihilation order remains, and we will see that dealt with in the next chapter. This has been the Springfield Church of the Brethren Message of the Week from Pastor Dave Weiss.